John 17:17 says God's word is truth. Not the truth, it is truth. So truth is whatever God says.
Last week we looked at Jesus coming to those that are down and out. We're going to look at a man who was literally up and in. All right. Verse 3. And he sought to see who Jesus was. So he was curious. It's interesting how Jesus meets you where you are. But he could not see him because Jesus is coming into the city of Jericho. He couldn't see him because of the crowd, for he was of short stature. He was short. So he ran ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he, Jesus, was going to pass that way. Now notice what he does. He's got enough of a desire. He doesn't know much about him, but he was curious. He wants to see him. And when he gets there, the people are in his way. His own limitation keeps him from seeing Jesus. He's too short. He can't see over the crowd. But he doesn't allow his own limitation to stop him from what he wants to do. So he climbs up in a tree so he can look down at the procession of Jesus coming by. To do that, he had to humble himself. He had to climb up like a young boy into the tree, and they would have recognized who he was because of his robes. They would know who he was. He was the IRS agent. He was the regional IRS agent. They knew who he was. So he had to put his dignity aside and climb up in that tree. And he's just there out of curiosity. But he's enough curious. He wants to see Jesus enough for himself. He's heard about him, but he wants to see him for himself. And the question to say is, have you seen him for yourself? Or have you just heard about him? Sometimes what keeps us from seeing him for ourselves is we're not willing to humble ourselves and climb up in the tree. We want to take our dignity with us to see him. He had to lay his dignity aside in order to see Jesus. Oh, but what a trade he made. Oh, but what a trade he made. Verse 5. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up, and he saw him, and he said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your home. Wow. All the people in the crowd, all the religious leaders following along in this procession, the people in Jericho that were believers and other people who would have longed to hear him say, I want to come and stay at your house. The Pharisees who would have loved to have Jesus come in their house. Why? Because then they could brag that this rabbi was in their house. And Jesus looks up at Zacchaeus and says, Zacchaeus, hurry up, come down, because today I want to stay in your house. Reminds me of a scripture where Jesus says, behold, I knock at the door of your heart. If anyone will open the door, my Father and I will come in and dwell there. He's knocking at the door of your heart this morning, saying, can I come in to stay in your house, to stay in your life? I've seen you. I've seen you climb that tree. I've seen you desire me. I've seen you want, and you may not understand, because Zacchaeus didn't understand, it's just a desire. I see the desire there. Can you come down? Humble yourself and come down, because I want to come and stay in you. I want to remain in you. I want to dwell in you, in your life. Well, let's see what the Pharisees, how they react to this. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. But when they, ever want to know who the they are? Yeah, well, you know what they're saying? Who are they? Well, in this case, we know who the they are. It's the Pharisees. It's the religious leaders. Those that are there to represent God to the people. And they don't realize That's God among them. They don't see that he's God dwelling in the flesh. They don't see that because all they've got their eyes on is who they are and the attention and the position that they have. See, when your eyes are on you, it's hard to see him for who he is. But when they saw it, they all complained, saying, he has gone to be a guest with a man who is a sinner. Now remember who Jesus is. He's God in the flesh. This is God saying, I want to be in his house. And God's representatives are judging him for choosing to eat with whom he wants to eat instead of learning from it. See, religion is trying to make God do what we think he ought to do. And Christianity is when we've given ourselves over to him so that we do what he wants us to do instead of trying to get him to do what we think he ought to do. And they were upset. They complained that he would eat with a sinner like Zacchaeus. All right? Now let's look at Zacchaeus, verse 8. Zacchaeus stood and he said to the Lord, look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I've taken anything from anyone by false accusations, I restore fourfold. Something's happened to Zacchaeus. Something's happened to him that's changed him on the inside in his heart. Because now, instead of being told, notice Jesus isn't saying, in order to come to me, you've got to give half of your money away. Earlier on, just the chapter before, there was a rich young ruler that came to Jesus and tries to justify himself by saying, what do I have to do? I want to follow you. And Jesus said, here's what you've got to do. You've got to keep all the commands. Oh, I've done those since I was a youth. All right. Then here's the only thing that you lack is to take all this wealth that you have and give it to sell your stuff and give what you get to the poor and then come follow me. In other words, Jesus saw that in his life, something else was in his heart that was more important to him than following Jesus. And Jesus was trying to reach in there and identify that to get that set aside so that he could come and follow him. Zacchaeus has already set aside his dignity, has already set aside his position by climbing up on that tree, and Jesus has responded by coming. Jesus doesn't say, in order to follow me, you've got to give away every half of what you have. Zacchaeus wants to do it. It's not so that he can follow Jesus, because he has now had an encounter with the living Christ. It's changed him. So the desires of his heart are now lined up with the desire and will of Jesus. So you don't line your desires up so you can follow him. It's because you've seen him and had an encounter with him. It changes you. And I guess the question we need to ask ourselves is, how much has our encounter with Christ changed us? How much has it changed us? All right. Let's go look at some other things. Unless we have his heart. Well, let's go to Luke chapter 9. I knew we were going to get there. I just was ahead of myself. Luke chapter 9, we're going to go to verse 51. This is a great story. Now it came to pass, when the time had come for him to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. He's on his way to Jerusalem because he knows it's the time for him to give himself up to be crucified. And he sent messengers before his face, and as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. He had a large crowd that followed him, and he was well known at that time. And so what he would do to prepare for when he came to a village, if he was going to stay there, is he would send disciples ahead of him to let them know he was coming and to prepare a place for him to stay, prepare food to eat for everybody, because he had this long entourage that was coming with him. And so this is a Samaritan village. Now remember, we've talked about this last year or earlier this year when we spent so much time in John chapter 4 with the Samaritan woman at the well, that the Jews hated the Samaritans, and of course, therefore, the Samaritans hated the Jews. It really was a racial thing because the Samaritans were the people they were half Jew and half Gentile. And so because in the Jews' eyes, they weren't pure Jew, they looked down on them as if they compromised. And the Gentiles, the Samaritans, of course, react by thinking the Jews are prejudiced, and they were. And so they developed their own place of worship, which was Mount Gerizim, which was the mountain that the woman at the issue of well got into the debate with Jesus about, which she said, well, we say on this mountain we're supposed to worship. You say in Jerusalem you're supposed to worship. So Jesus is coming into a village that hates Jews, and Jesus is a Jew. And so he comes into this village. And let's see what happens. He sent his disciples ahead to prepare it for him, verse 53. But they did not receive him because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw that the people did not receive him, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Then the New King James says, just as Elijah did? I mean, they've rejected you. They've offended you. Lord, can we call fire down on them? Burn them, fry them. They deserve that. I mean, they were zealous for him. They'd given up everything to follow him. And they're upset because people are rejecting him. They're offended at him. They don't recognize him for who they are. So they want them to get what they deserve because they've not treated Jesus correctly. So they want to take the power, the authority that Jesus gave them earlier in this chapter. And they want to use that authority they've been given to call fire down on heaven and destroy them. So this is what they're doing. They're looking at this situation through their own understanding. And they're saying, this isn't right. The people we know who he is. He's the Messiah. He's the Son of God. He's the one we've been waiting for. He's the one through whom this whole earth was created. The beginning of John says, in him was life, and the life was light of men, and our life came through him. And he said he came unto his own, and they knew them not. These people are rejecting him. They're rejecting who he is. And boy, that's just wrong. So they deserve to be judged. We want to take the authority, the power we've been given, and we want to exercise it for the way we think it ought to be exercised. Listen carefully. And let's see what Jesus says about that. Verse 55, instead of commending them and saying, yeah, go for it. But he turned and he rebuked them. They're sincere. They're upset. They're offended for him. Oh, this is a good place to stop for a moment. They're offended for him, but we're going to see he's not offended. Remember the trouble Eve got into? By trying to defend God when God never told her to defend him? Just obey him. That's when we begin to take things in our own hands and use our own religious judgment instead of just obeying. I'm sure they were expecting Jesus to say, yeah, go for it. And he rebuked them. He rebuked them even though they were sincere. Sincerity is nice, but it's not always right. You can be sincere in wrong. A lot of those people that knock on your door on Saturday morning are very sincere, but they're wrong. And you can be sincere and have a wrong heart. And that's dangerous. Because notice what he says. He turned and rebuked them, verse 55, and said, you don't know what manner of spirit you are of. Whoa. This is his disciples. And they're not doing this for themselves. They're doing it for the honor that they think he deserves. But Jesus is saying, you don't know what spirit you're of. In other words, your heart has entertained a wrong spirit. And this is where people fail to understand. You can do good things for God with the wrong spirit and be completely off track. Read 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but I have not love. To God, it's a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. If I have all faith as to remove mountains, wow. I mean, perform miracles. That's what they were going to call fire down out of heaven. If I can do all these mighty deeds, these miracles, if I operate in the gifts of the Spirit powerfully, and I do all these things, but I don't do it motivated by the love of God for those people, then in God's eyes, he said it's nothing. I've completely missed the mark. So in God's kingdom, in his eyes, your motivation for what you do is almost more important than what you do. And what makes it dangerous is you can be exactly right in what you see. They were right. They were being disrespectful to the Son of God. They were rejecting the opportunity that he was giving them. They were exactly right in their judgment of what was going on, in their analysis, but completely wrong in their motivation of what to do. And so often, we step out to get things right for God and do things right. Isn't it interesting? It's almost always what somebody else is doing wrong. And Jesus almost never says anything about what to do about somebody else is doing wrong, but he says a lot to do about what we're doing. If your right eye offends you, be merciless with it. Pluck it out. No, not literally. If your right hand's causing you trouble, cut it off. Wow. In other words, you need to be severe in treating yourself in this way. When you're judging others, what you're really seeing is what's going on in you. And what we're seeing here this morning is if we don't have the heart of God, if we don't have his motive, what he's looking for, then we're going to completely miss it. We may see great miracles happening. We may see fire coming down, but is it going to carry out the kingdom of God? These same disciples, Peter tried to talk him out of going to the cross. What if Peter succeeded? Peter said, this doesn't make sense. I mean, you're right at the point of accomplishing what you came to do, because he didn't understand what he came to do, even though Jesus kept telling him. It didn't make sense that he came to die. It didn't make sense that he would come to die. That would be his purpose, because they didn't understand what was behind it. Instead of trying to figure out what's right in God's eyes, let's get his heart first. Make sure we have his heart. This is why the Bible says love covers a multitude of sins. When we're acting in love, it'll cover all kinds of mistakes you make. Jesus said, you don't know what kind of spirit you're of. You don't know what you've led in your spirit. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went on to another village. Let's go to Jonah, chapter 3. Well, go to Jonah chapter 4, and we'll go back a verse. Jonah, story we're all familiar with, and I'll probably summarize a lot of this. I'll start while you're looking. The last verse of chapter 3, you know the story of Jonah. Jonah is a prophet. And God spoke to him and said, I want you to go to Nineveh, and I want you to preach. Tell them to get your house in order, because in 7 days you're going to die. And Jonah got in a boat and went the opposite direction. That's the story. Jonah got on the boat. The storm came up, and it becomes clear that Jonah's rebelling against God. So they throw him overboard. A great fish swallows him up. And that fish was God's protection in the water, but it was a protection that was designed to make Jonah decide he didn't want to stay there. And then this fish throws him up onto the sea, once Jonah changes his mind. And then Jonah goes into the city, preaches this message, and then goes out on the outside of the hill on the outside of the city to watch what's happened. Now, God's message was, in 7 days, you're going to die. He didn't say anything about, if you get things right, I'm going to forgive you. And the king of Nineveh holds a fast and says, let's pray and seek maybe this God will show mercy to us. And this is where we're going to end. The last verse of chapter 3, God does. Then God saw their works, that they turned from their evil way, and God relented of the disaster that he said would bring upon them, and he did not do it. Chapter 4, but it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. That sounds like the older brother, doesn't it? These people are evil. I mean, they're evil right down to their core. And God's going to forgive them just because they've repented and said they're changing? And Jonah's angry. He's angry. This is, if you study carefully, this is why he didn't go to Nineveh. This is why he disobeyed God. He was afraid that if they repented, God would forgive them. So he didn't want to even give them the opportunity to hear the word. Because they didn't deserve to be saved. They didn't deserve it. So I'm not even going to tell them, because God might decide to forgive them. Woo! And so when all that happens, his worst nightmare came true, Jonah's angry. Let's see how God deals with him. So he prayed to the Lord and said, Lord, was this not what I said to you when I was still in my country? See, that's why he didn't want to go. He said, didn't I tell you that you might forgive them? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abounded in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. Now therefore, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live. Aren't you? It's a good thing God doesn't treat Jonah the way Jonah wouldn't treat them. Some of you may have cried that at some point and God didn't listen to you either. And the Lord said, is it right for you to be angry? So Jonah went out of the city and sat on the east side of the city and pouted. Doesn't say that, but that's literally what he was doing. There he made himself a shelter and sat under the shade that he might see what would become of the city. And the Lord prepared a plant and made it to come up over Jonah, that it might be shade for his head to deliver him from his misery. And Jonah was very grateful for the plant. But as morning dawned the next day, God prepared a worm, and it damaged the plant so that it withered. And it happened that when the sun arose, God prepared a vehement east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head so that he grew faint, that he wished death for himself. And he said, it's better for me to die than to live. And God said to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? And Jonah's answer is, it is right for me to be angry with the plant, even unto death. But the Lord said, this is the key. You've had pity on this plant for which you've not labored, nor made it grow, when it came up at night and it perished in a day. Should not I have pity on Nineveh, that great city in which are more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, or good and evil, and their livestock? Jonah was a prophet. He was a man of God. But he developed this attitude in his heart that there were people that didn't deserve God's mercy. Now listen carefully what I just said. It got into his heart that there are people, and especially the Ninevites, that did not deserve God's mercy. But what is mercy? Isn't mercy when you don't get what you deserve? Or you get what you didn't deserve? Throughout this whole story, there's one consistent person that's disobedient. that's speaking out, I'd rather die than go through this. And God didn't give him what he deserved, did he? God gave mercy to Jonah. In fact, Jonah was a prophet because of God's mercy. Jonah breathed every breath he breathed because of God's mercy. Every beat of his heart was God's mercy. His life was God's mercy. Everything he ate came from God's mercy. And this little plant that grew up, that he became very fond of, that was given to him as the mercy of God. And he's lost touch with the heart of God. And Jonah has substituted himself as the judge. This is what James says in chapter 4. He says, when you judge other people, you've taken yourself and made yourself the lawgiver. Because only the giver of the law has the right to judge whether somebody's kept it or not. Jonah was putting himself in God's place without God's heart. And he was judging this city because of how he saw they were, but he wasn't looking at them through the heart of God. Because remember why Jesus came: to seek and to save that was lost.